Are you tired of the same mundane routine every time you take to the skies? Do you want your air travel to be more of an experience than a boring old trip? Kahuna Airlines, we're dedicated to providing flights that you'll remember for the rest of your life. Other airlines are overly concerned with the trivial aspects of flying, like comfort and safety. Well, here at Kahuna Airlines, we're all about good vibes and groovy times. Stop flying with airplanes with the most basic of accommodations and hop aboard our totally far-out aircraft. Who needs seats and safety belts when you can travel at hundreds of miles per hour, surrounded by waterfall, beautiful foliage, music from the most advanced of synthesizers? Those corporate clowns and their lame planes just take you from point A to point B, with virtually no entertainment in between. Why spend hours on a cross-Pacific flight reading a book or dwelling on the insignificance of your life when you can enjoy a drink from our vodka reservoir and enjoy having songs about island life sung at you for hours on end? You could even be among our luckiest passengers and experience the thrill of a mid-air flight transference. Kahuna Airlines is not responsible for lost luggage or passengers, and any instance of abduction or removal from the plane by third parties is not the fault or responsibility of Kahuna Airlines or its subsidiaries. Kahuna Airlines cannot fully confirm the on-time arrival or safety of any of our flights. Kahuna Airlines, a groovy flight, guaranteed. Groovy guarantee, not a guarantee.
Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Cody. I am one of the co-hosts.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Will.
We are without Kate this week. As last week we were without Luke. This week we're without Kate, and next week we will be without me. So a little bit of a different vibe, maybe. Hopefully not. I don't think so. Last week was good. So we'll keep on doing what we can with who we have and make the most of it. But today we're discussing chapters 5 and 6 of Vineland. Will, if you would be so kind as to read us a summary of those chapters.
Oh, I was supposed to write one?
Did you? The email.
All right, found it. Never mind.
Perfect.
Chapter 5. On her way out of town, Zoid had passed along a curious business card to Prairie. One that, apparently, he'd received after a long stretch of passive suicidality manifested, due to Frenezy's abandonment, via a few months' employment by Kahuna Airlines, a budget Hawaiian offering. His role was a unique one, the lounge piano player. He'd been impressed to join their ranks following a stay on the islands when he and Sasha, Frenezy's mother, had sorted out their sort of shared custody. She was no fan of his, the old-school anarchist seeing him as little more than an overbaked sperm donor. Furthermore, they discuss in hushed tones the man Frenezy had left her family for, Brock Vond. He said to be exactly the super-fascist they'd both spent their lives fighting, and such a disappointment on Sasha's mind leads her to even suspect Zoid has turned. From then on, Zoid assumed his mopey condition, and applied for the position variously described as a gig of death and spooky. As it turns out, as the little guy in the sector, Kahuna was unable to justify the protections fee to ensure against the periodic alien experimentation upon various passengers, each of whom were assured to be back home safe and sound soon. In that setting, the role of a lounge singer on a trans-Pacific flight becomes clear, as thanks to strange Mr. Takeshi Fumimota, after accompanying the synthesizer with a G-tuned uke, passes him the card and promises he'll remember it when he needs it. Moving on to chapter 6, finally we meet Frenezy. She's living in the Sun Belt with a low-level functionary, Flash Fletcher. How they'd met is as yet obscured, but it happened at Vaughn's re-education camp, apparently where she'd gone after things ended between them. They were both in the difficult position of former revolutionaries, cursed to lives of surveilled and certified mediocrity. Neither their old partners in crime nor the state at whose feet they laid prostrate would dare believe their sincerity at this point. They do have a son, though, at least, Justin, who seems as normal as one could hope. The rug is pulled for them when the stipend checks they rely upon stop clearing one day. Alerted by Flash's call from work, notifying her of the sudden deletion of various people's files, she spends hours looking for a place that will cash the check, but fails to do so, being grimly reminded of the omnipotent computers which tie together the banks and the government's edicts. They do not sleep. Meanwhile, we are treated to a flash summary of Sasha's life, growing up in a union organizer's home, tormented by her own weak point for a man in uniform, which she's now sure she's passed along to her daughter. Regardless, she had internalized the golden rule of the day: loose lips sink ships, and the ship she cared about was a people's party. Alas, the man she eventually would marry turned out to be a bit of an apolitical, though he'd been happy for decades to come to support her passions. She met him during her years as a nightclub singer, dreaming of being something of a Billie Holiday. This all comes together with Frenzy realizing some of the truths her mother had tried to impart on her all those childhood years ago, those she'd shrugged off before adopting as costume for a few short years. Either the eyes of God, the federal government, or a bank computer, all of us simply are living or dead, and her family has just been marked 0.
All right. Thank you for that. Well, let's start with our general thoughts on these chapters. How did you guys feel about these two particular chapters?
Yeah, I probably prefer chapter 5 to chapter 6, personally. Chapter 5 is some of the more memorable parts of this book, with the airliner and it being like a big club instead of kind of the
Yeah.
typical row of seats. That imagery stuck with me after I first read the book years ago. And we do get, these chapters are really interesting. They are kind of a transition point where we switch POVs from Zoid to Frenessy. Who I think you could argue that Frenessy is the actual main character of this book. I think she's kind of the one that's at the center of the plot. She's the one whose actions kind of drive everything, and are the reason why all this stuff is happening. Yeah, I really like these chapters though. Even just all the discussion of the computer and the description of Frenzy having to cash the check and everything and all of that and all the stuff about, I really enjoy all the stuff about the her parents, and it's there's some really cool parts there where, like, the part about her mom thinking her dad was such a great listener and such a cool and deep guy, and according to him, he was just trying to get laid,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
Um, I really like that part, and the part at the end with, like, the end of chapter 6, like the description of the gate and the different gates to the military base. I really love that part. That little that last like page and a half. I kind of struggle to define why. I mean, it's just I find it so evocative and so like fun to picture. I've actually, whenever I was writing or rewriting my first novel, I went back and picked up that chapter, that the end of chapter 6, and kind of directly riffed on a lot of the same stuff in one section of that novel, just because I don't know why I find it so evocative, but it's a really compact like view of like a really cool. I just find it really cool, and like really I'm struggling to kind of put it into words, but it's very evocative and fun to picture. Um but yeah, I mean, then chapter 5, we get, the two songs in that chapter are kind of nice in terms of they're kind of low stakes, and chapter 5 is just kind of generally a bit it's one of the funnier chapters, and it's more low stakes. It's kind of more of a hangout chapter where we're just kind of hanging out in Hawaii, and it is kind of nice that we do get, although we don't get the end of or the beginning of how I don't think we ever get the beginning of how Zoid and Frenessy really met. I could be wrong. But it is, the breakup scene is really well done.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I mean it does, there are some movies about Hawaii that I really enjoy. It does seem to be kind of a something I didn't think about until reading this book is kind of Hollywood's it is kind of a Hollywood trope to set movies in Hawaii. Um yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to enjoy in these chapters. These chapters are kind of where the book starts really gets going, and starts kind of really delving into the history of everyone, and the focus kind of slides backwards in a way that as that in oncoming chapters, it also kind of does that where we kind of go between the present and the past. We kind of slip between the two. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I do think these. So I'm actually kind of on the other side in that I think I like chapter 6 more than 5. I do like 5, but I do feel like 6 has some of the strongest prose in the book, at least up to this point for sure. But it definitely is a sort of zoom out, and more of a wider scope on these characters, and you're really starting to finally dive into the story a little bit more in that sense. And I do. There is a lot to unpack in these chapters. There is, I think, especially like you said, the end of chapter 6 is it's very cinematic in the same way that at lot 49 there were certain scenes and certain sections that felt very cinematic, like Oedipus driving by herself, and the description of the city as a circuit board and that kind of thing. I think that's kind of similar to certain passages in here, especially at that point. And I do think you're right in describing Frenessy as possibly being, if she's not the main character, she's certainly a sort of central mass around which everything else in the story orbits. So she may not necessarily get the most screen time, so to speak, but I think that she's essentially at the center of this story. So I'm really excited to kind of dive in and pick apart these chapters. Will, what did you think of these two?
I'm kind of split if we're going. I'm kind of a split mind when it comes to which of the chapters I prefer.
Mm-hmm.
But I do love both of them for very different reasons, as you both pointed out. I mean, the chapter 5 is just, and it's funny that you phrased it as lower stakes, because it absolutely is. At the same time, we were talking about aliens just suddenly showing up, and there being like a global protection scheme to keep them away from the major airlines. Like that is, again, it is lower stakes for the characters, but it's absolutely hilarious. Because it does just come out of nowhere, and it doesn't connect to anything else really except for themes. And I just think that is such a fun inclusion, especially the way that the issues are solved in that chapter, whether it's Zoid's pent up emotions or it's the actual alien abductions. The solutions to all the problems in that chapter are hilarious. And then the chapter 6, it is the beginning of the really deep kind of just like stringing along character introductions into each other that this book is full of, that I just love. I love the way that it's done. It's not a terribly interesting subject matter, because most of it is just like, here are these relatively normal people's lives. Because sure,
Mm-hmm.
Sasha's life was crazy compared to most Americans, but for a Pynchon novel, like, great, she grew up in an anarchist family, sang in some nightclubs, married a guy that she thought she understood better than she really did. Like, that's very boring compared to most of his characters, and Fletcher even more so. But the way it's talked about is just stunning. So, yeah, and I like both of them quite a bit. And I do agree. I do think that if we're going to talk about who's the protagonist, it is either, in my mind, Prairie or Frenessy. And
Mm-hmm.
it's split because if you're going to say one of them's the hero, it really has to be Prairie. But Frenzy is the center of the story in every way.
So on that note, as we talked about, we get a lot more nuance to these characters. And I know we're only at this point about not quite a third of the way through just yet, but if we were to compare this to his other works, as far as getting character development, this much character development this early on, it's definitely an advancement from the books that came before this. I don't think Gravity's Rainbow or Lot 49 or V had as much character development at that point in the story. That that a third of the way, almost a third, maybe a fourth of the way through the story at that point. But do you feel like it's? I mean, I think both of you have already kind of said that it is. But I mean, is it at this point? Do you feel like you have a pretty good idea of who these characters are, even though you've already read this, the story and you know where things go? Do you think that he's done a good job up to this point, really letting us get to know these characters and their relations to each other?
I'm gonna say that yes, with the exception of Frenzy, and I feel like that's quite intentional at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I could have used more in the earlier chapters about Zoid and Frenzy. I know we get the wedding scene in 3 and 4, and the part that y'all went over and that sticks out, I think, to me and to probably a lot of people about Zoid and Frenezy's views on love and whether or not it can save anyone. I think that's pretty telling. But that being said, I could in the earlier chapters before this, I could have used more about their relationship and stuff. So we mostly get stuff from Zoid's perspective. And Zoid just doesn't end up being a super important character to pretty much from chapter 6 onwards. I could be
Yeah.
wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure, we move away from Zoid and we kind of stay away from Zoid for the rest of the book. And I don't necessarily have a super strong opinion on whether or not that's a good thing or not, because I like Zoid. Um, but he doesn't end up being a super important character. And we do, he's the kind of the POV character for the first 5 chapters, basically. Which is an interesting authorial decision by Pynchon. It's something that it kind of reminds me of the structure of Against the Day, although Against the Day is a lot more kaleidoscopic and all inclusive, and there's a lot more characters. Um, Against the Day, like the POV character is constantly changing. By the end of Against the Day, like we get a strong, like a really long section of the book that's a minor character from like page like 200, dominates the last, I think, 150 pages of Against the Day.
Mm.
And stuff like that. It does seem to be something that Pynchon was kind of playing with a lot more in his later time period. I mean, he does that in Gravity's Rainbow some, but Gravity's Rainbow is so hard to pin down, and like, it's so hard to kind of like, I find that people focus too much on Slothrop with Gravity's Rainbow. I don't think that was necessarily Pynchon's intention with that book. It doesn't start with Slothrop and stuff. Yeah, I mean, it is really, Gravity's Rainbow and onwards, he does seem to be a lot of the time, except for maybe, I mean, Inherent Vice and Bleeding Edge, I think, are pretty focused on their POV characters.
Yeah.
But in general, Pynchon kind of seems to he loves to kind of mess with the reader in that way of kind of throwing curveballs at the reader in terms of who is being focused on.
Yeah, I find it interesting how you say that Zoid is less important, because he absolutely takes a back seat. He is not driving any plot beyond chapter 5. But I do think that his presence is felt. I think that there's a reason that so much time is spent with him, with his perspective. I do think that throughout the rest of the book, it is important to keep his perspective in mind, and as a comparison and contrast to everything else we're going to see.
That's definitely fair. He's like Isaiah 2:4, just kind of in the shadows for the rest of the story, but he's there. I do think it's, I on the note of Zoid, because this is, I think, probably the last time that we'll really spend a good chunk of time talking about him. Especially because, as you both mentioned, he kind of takes a back seat from here forward. I do really like the way, even though I see where Luke is coming from, and I do agree that it would have been nice to have a little more examination of his and Fernessi's relationship earlier on. But I do think that what we get really provides a lot of important context going forward. And especially, I really like the scene where they are on adjacent balconies and kind of talking to each other, and Sasha's experiencing all of this. And I really like, there's a specific line in here on page 58 for me, where it just says, he looked old enough to have been through it before, but who knew? Maybe this was his maiden voyage into the green seas of jealousy. That green seas of jealousy, I really like. I just, the color imagery we've talked about in Mason Dixon, how excellent he is, Pynchon is at using color to really paint his prose, for lack of a better term there. And I think that little sentence just does such a great job of kind of letting us know what Zoid is going through. I can't help but feel bad for the guy. He is kind of a sad sack, and it sucks to see him go through everything, but I really do enjoy the way that these brief glimpses we get of their relationship, especially coming off the last chapter and seeing their wedding and everything. And then this is the kind of disintegration of all of that. It's brief, but I think it's very effective.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying about wanting to understand more about Zoid and Fernessi's relationships, both of you. But I do think that there's a certain way in which the way we're introduced to the family, while I'm not sure that this is any sort of pretense that Pynchon intended, or that it's one that really makes sense as like a solid frame to read the book through, I do see these first 5 chapters, basically, maybe first 4, as essentially kind of summarizing what Prairie knows about her family. We see this very two-dimensional view of Zoid that is reinforced most strongly by his conversations with his daughter, when in every other situation he is contradicting what people assume about him. Mm-hmm. But with Prairie, he's happy to let the illusion lie. Whether it's truly an illusion or not, he clearly doesn't think it's who he is. He doesn't think of himself as just a sour old pothead. I think that with that kind of reading, again, not a strong paradigm, but in that way, I view it as kind of, we are introduced to the way that people see them, but these chapters, we begin to see how they see themselves and the way they see each other.
Yeah, that's a good point.
One thing I wanted to add, just real quick, this is an aside. But since I wasn't here last week, I was planning on bringing up last week, if I had been there, the fact that Zoid and Fernessi's wedding, it does seem to me, maybe just like, I've seen a picture of Richard Farina and Mimi Baez's wedding, which, pictures from that time period kind of have that sepia tone
yeah,
to them,
yeah.
that kind of lends. It makes everything seem like it was like all the pictures are taken like a golden sunlight. But I have seen a picture from their wedding, and this is obviously not, this is an aside, but I do wonder how much of that wedding scene is supposed to be reminiscent of Richard Farina and Mimi Baez's wedding. Anyway.
Yeah, even if it wasn't like written to be a clone of it, I mean, it might have been the inspiration.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's one of like Pynchon's few public appearances that are kind of known.
Yeah. Well, moving forward, in kind of going back to the mention of the humor in this chapter, I do like that Hawaii is kind of described as a destination for broken-hearted California men, which kind of is the antithesis of what I think Hollywood and so many other stories kind of present it as. And it's funny, and that's something that comes back up in Inherent Vice as well. And then we also have the suicide fantasy package that Zoid is offered by the desk clerk, which I thought was pretty funny in its kind of dark way.
Yeah, I do really like that. And I do think that there is kind of, I have no idea if this is true. I've never been to Hawaii and I've spent a minimal amount of time in California. Um, but I think the Pitch and Wiki gets into this, that it is kind of a real thing. Or somewhere I've seen that that's actually a real thing, that people will go to Hawaii to at least attempt suicide, which is odd to me. That whole thing did remind me of and forgive me, please, but forgetting Sarah Marshall,
I thought the
which
same
Yeah.
thing.
yeah,
Don't feel
which
bad about it.
in my defense, that movie did come out when I was in high school, and I was the right age to really love that movie. Um, but yeah, I don't necessarily want to belabor the point of forgetting Sarah Marshall being at all similar to Pynchon, but yeah.
No, I
You
think that's true. And Cody, you point out I think what you might call the baseline Hollywood trope of Hawaii being this like beautiful, perfect place where nothing bad happens.
mm-hmm.
And there is this kind of counter trope that I think Luke was trying to get at earlier with like some of the Elvis Presley movies and Forgetting Sarah Marshall and various others throughout the decades that really are just absurd pretenses to like make a vacation for the actors.
Mm-hmm. That's
And yeah. I find that all of that in conjunction with the fact that Zoid probably is suicidal. I mean, he gets a job that is described as a death trap, essentially. I do think he is sincere about it. I don't think it is just melodrama.
Well, it kind of touches on that. He talks about how he was angry enough, or almost angry enough, but couldn't go through. I think he's at that point where it's a lingering thought for him, and he just doesn't know what to do, and he's still kind of just wandering, trying to find meaning, which is why he picks up such a shit job. Which on that note, that segues us perfectly into that whole bit. I do, and Luke talked about it earlier. I absolutely love the kind of horrific vibe of that plane with the open top and the everything just designed to look like a bad hula party. It's grotesque in its presentation, but it's so accurate to something that would probably existed in some kind of disturbing cocaine fever dream at the time.
Yeah, it wouldn't. It's the type of thing that it really wouldn't surprise me if, like, um, I do kind of wonder where he did get the inspiration for all the interior decoration in the plane, like the mini waterfall and stuff. It's the kind of
Yeah.
thing that, like, I could see like a movie villain having that as like his, like his like home base, or like his like Air
James
Force
Bond
One or
villain.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I suspect it might be Pynchon might have come up with it himself. But I do kind of wonder if there is a pop culture thing he's referencing.
I couldn't think of anything pop culture wise, but I do get, I mean, that was around the time, the 70s, 60s and 70s, when that decor was certainly prevalent, I think, in a lot of areas. And I think airports would probably have definitely taken advantage of, decorating like that. And so it's probably just playing up that whole imagery for it. I do want to just read this paragraph where it talks about Zoid's job at the on the flights. On westbound flights, Zoid's job at the keyboard, like that of the hula dancers, flame eaters, cocktail waitresses, and bartenders, was to keep passengers from thinking about what lay in store for them on the Honolulu end. The luggage misconnected and untraceable, the absent bus links to hotels which had already lost everybody's reservations, the failure of Jack Lord to show up as promised in the brochure for photo opportunities. Kahuna's all but unpredictable scheduling produced arrival times lost in mid-watch hours when airport security grew eager to play roles with disagreeable subtexts, harassing the single women, sweating the dopers, abusing the elderly and foreign, staring, needling, trying to get something going. Where were the traditional local cuties with the flower lays, one for each deplaning neck? For you, the armed uniformed gents all broke out into high barks of laughter. At this hour, what for? It's that idea of Zoid, of a knowingly incompetent airline that has to hire someone on to keep people distracted from how bad they are at actually doing what they're doing.
I mean, that sounds like airlines today.
Yeah.
They mostly hire like actors to do the in-flight safety announcements, which I'm
Yeah.
not sure is as effective as a, what was it, like an orchestral ukulele synthesizer?
Yeah. With like eight different ukuleles, I think, was it? A
I
baby
do
grand
think
synthesizer is how it was described.
I do
Beautiful.
think to go back a little bit, I do think it's interesting that Zoid, right after getting broken up with, perhaps for the final time, immediately goes and tries to find a gig to play.
Yeah.
Um, it's an interesting kind of, I don't necessarily. I have friends that are musicians. Kate and Cody are musicians, but I've never really. I've heard of people being, depressed or anxious or different things and wanting to play their instrument in private. I've just never heard of somebody going out and wanting to play a gig basically whenever they're sad and depressed.
That
I think
actually
it's
is
a,
something I can speak to.
yeah,
I've been in that situation before, and yeah, I had times where in the punk band I was in, um, I had a couple of shows where it was just like I had a shitty day or a shitty night before, and getting out and playing like it really absolutely takes your mind off because you're forced to focus on the performance. And I think it also helps when you have people that you're playing music with that you're friends with. And I was and still am very close to the guys in that band. So it was a really good way of kind of forgetting about it and putting it aside at least for a little while. So I get where he's coming from with that. Absolutely. Not that I'm going to go run off and play lounge music on a god awful air flight, but whatever helps. I mean, we know Zoid wanted to do his lounge CD or lounge album to win back for Nessie. So that's certainly where his mind goes, I think, in these kind of situations. It's his default.
Yeah, I wonder about whether there's any specific commentary that we were supposed to take about the airline, because this is the time that this was being written was the era of the Concorde.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, sure, the Concorde was a technological upgrade in terms of air flight, but otherwise, outside of that, pretty much every innovation in the sector had just been cost-cutting measures.
Yeah.
Going from the old school days of you dress up, wear a suit, and get served fresh steak and vegetable, like roasted veggies.
When flying was supposed to be an
Yeah.
experience. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And I'm not, I can't square that circle, but it's interesting.
Keeping with the music portion of the conversation, there is a ton of musical references in not just in this book, but in these two chapters. There are all kinds of these little musical Easter eggs that I found, and the musician in me was pleasantly engaged with those and constantly trying to find what he was getting at with them. We mentioned the ukuleles, which is a recurring instrument. I think now we've had it. I know it's in Against the Day pretty out front. It was in Mason and Dixon, I think, right? They mentioned it.
I think you're correct. I want to say,
But it was anachronistically mentioned. It hadn't really technically been invented at the time it was
It was
mentioned.
a tiny guitar or something.
Yeah, tiny guitar. Thank you. And it's just that instrument that comes up so often in his books, and I love it. It's a bizarre choice, but it's a kind of underappreciated instrument. I think it's always seen as a goof, but if it's played well, it's a beautiful instrument.
Yeah, I've been looking into the history of stringed instruments the last few weeks, and the ukulele is a very interesting history. I recommend everybody look into it. But very long story short is that the Portuguese guitar is technically different from the guitar that we all think of. And the Portuguese sailors who made landfall in Hawaii brought them along, and the Hawaiians basically just started making their own versions. And, they had fewer animal guts, so they made it with 4 strings and made it smaller because their trees are smaller. And, Pynchon loves it when native and oppressed peoples adopt and not adopt appropriate the the ruling class's art. He really does love that. I mean, I imagine that's part of his infatuation with jazz.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
I don't get the sense it's the same as his love for the kazoo, which I think is almost entirely novelty.
Yeah, that has to be. I do also love the description of the as we already mentioned, the baby grand synthesizer, which contains 3 orchestral sections of 8 ukes each. And as it's described in here, the critter liked to drift off pitch on him, or worse, into that shrillness that sours the stomach, curtails seduction, poisons a careful ambience. Nothing he could find in the dash one under the seat ever corrected what he more and more took to be conscious decisions by the machine. The idea of a I guess a somewhat sentient instrument that constantly tries to I guess bedevil its user and its performer is hilarious. As someone who has played many instruments and struggled with especially the cheaper ones, that reads very true. They have this weird tendency to fight against you when you're trying to play them.
Yeah, and I do wonder if that particular paragraph isn't, very much kind of him Pynchon going back to his old V days of talking about how humans anthropomorphize these objects. Because, yeah, it's the scene with aliens. It could be a sentient piano, why not?
Yeah.
But it also is fundamentally, it's a synthesizer. It's one of the simplest electronic pieces of equipment you could create in terms of like what could go wrong bug-wise. And yet they've cheaped out so badly that it won't even play the same key every time you press it.
Yeah.
And so all Zoid can do is sit around imagining what the machinations of this busted synthesizer are.
And finding no help in the user manual, which is always the case. There's absolutely no answers in there.
Absolutely, yeah.
It is interesting that the synthesizer seems to have life of its own, and that it's electronic. Given Chapter 6's kind of on and off again meditation on computers, and how mysterious they at least probably seemed in the 70s and 80s, and yeah, I'm kind of struggling to formulate my thoughts on that, but it is kind of interesting that he repeatedly depicts them as having some type of mind of their own.
Yeah.
I also think it's interesting that the synthesizer is electronic and that it keeps messing up. I don't know anything about synthesizers or the how they're constructed or anything, but that type of thing, just from a very novice amateur, not even amateur, but non-musician standpoint, it seems like the type of thing that you would attribute more to a piano rather than a synthesizer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about digital audio and signal nonsense. I mean, that stuff is basically witchcraft. But I know enough about programming and about how you make computers and how you make like speakers and things and the way that synthesizers work on a theoretical level to know that no, that doesn't happen. It cannot happen. Like it's the only way it could happen is if the circuit boards had crisscrossing wires essentially. Like there would have to be a random number generator doing it essentially.
It's as a musician, it's always user error, but you always blame the instrument. That's just the rule.
But at the same time, it's a terrible airline. So they might have found just the worst synthesizer in existence.
They probably bought some busted ass cheap thing that they found at a thrift store somewhere and just cut corners wherever you can. So also continue on the music Easter eggs here. I had to look up because my brain isn't. I am a self-taught musician, so I never took like music classes or anything. But the E flat seventh, the arpeggiated E flat seventh, I looked it up, and I don't want to turn this into a Beato podcast, but it is a very lounge music note. So just Google arpeggiated E flat seventh. It's specifically diminished seventh, and I'm not going to get into the music theory part of that, but that chord is just, it embodies lounge music. If you are familiar, even a passing familiarity with lounge music, you will recognize that chord almost instantaneously, and that's, I think, specifically why he chose to use that note.
Yeah, in that same section, I really love the let me roll that little grass skirt and the zigzag of my embrace.
Mhm.
I whenever I used to smoke weed, I pretty much exclusively would smoke spliffs, which is a mixture of tobacco and weed. Um, but I'd always get comments from friends on how um, I was pretty good at rolling, and um, I love that whole song basically, at least the lyrics
It's a
to
great
it.
one. Yeah.
Yeah, then the equation of smoking weed and romance does seem to come up in Inherent Vice as well, where I think he writes like love notes on the joints and then smokes them
Mhm.
and stuff like that. I really love that song though. And the to go back to the audiobook thing, the guy on the audiobook who does the audiobook sings all the songs in this book.
Oh, does he? Is there like
Yeah.
accompanying music behind it, or is it just a cappella?
It's just him singing. I don't think there's accompanying music. I
Okay.
don't. He does seem to repeat the the melody, or like like the way he sings it. Like the song that he's singing it behind. He does seem to kind of repeat it as if it's the same song over and over, just with different lyrics.
Mm,
At least some
okay.
of it. Because yeah, it's not always clear like how. I mean, Pigeon does do a pretty good job of like with punctuation and line breaks of letting you know like the kind of syncopation of the singing. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about this. Cody's talked about it with trying to figure out what the backing song would be for a lot of them.
Yeah.
Is interesting to think about.
It's definitely. I'm glad you mentioned the way he syncopates it, because it shows that he really puts a lot of effort into not just coming up with the lyrics of the song, but of writing them in such a way that you can kind of catch a melody, or inadvertently stumble into whatever melody he's trying to get you into, even if you don't have a musical background. I think it's written, like you said, in such a way that you can land in there and get that feel for it.
Well, the
Yeah, definitely.
the zigzag grass skirt song might be one thing, but the funky coconut song, I can literally
Yes.
only read it in the tune of the "Hey Mr. President" song from Inside Llewyn Davis. If anybody has watched that movie, that is what's going through my head every time I read those lyrics.
We need to revisit that movie. I have seen it, but I think I saw it in theaters and never revisited it. So it's been like 10 years or something.
It it might be my favorite movie of theirs. So
Really?
yeah, it's
I haven't
really
seen that
good.
one. I need
Yeah.
to.
You would love it, Cody. I mean, it's a folk music
Yeah.
love like
I remember when it came
love
out, and it
story.
totally looked up my alley. I just never got around to it.
Yeah, the lyrics to that song do remind me of the "I've Got a Lovely Bunch of Coconuts,"
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
which I do think it's kind of riffing on maybe a little bit. I did look up the song for that, and the beat and the melody and everything don't seem to match up with the lyrics in the book in Vineland and the Wacky Coconut song, but they do kind of have a similar like children's song, but it also kind of has some innuendo to it as well. Kind of
Mhm.
feel.
Yeah, I'm trying to sing it to that tune, and I'm reverting to like a weird hymn. So I don't know what it's supposed to be at
Coconut
all.
him. Well, so, and that's another little right after that is another little Easter egg that I found with the reoccurrence of the B flat, and I mentioned this in, I want to say it was in lot 49, that B flat seems to be a recurring key, or note in this case, throughout most of his books, if not all of them. And I think we riffed on kind of why he chose that particular one, and it's made clear in here that it is being used as a sort of weapon against the people who have made their way onto the plane. And I just love that Zoid works that in as often as he can. Not that he makes it to a point to just constantly hammer that, but he's as as he's playing the song, he's making sure to work it in there. Ever the consummate musician there. And then the last musical little Easter egg I wanted to bring up, and this goes back to, again, me having been in a band, and not only being in a band, but this specifically cued the time where I was in between bands and so desperate to play drums that I ended up joining a church band. at the church where I was also working at the daycare as a side job. So in chapter 6 on page 79, when Sasha's playing with Eddie and Rico, it mentions that he's telegraphing chord changes to her. And for anyone who's been in, not necessarily, I mean, it kind of depends, I think, on the type of music you're playing. If there are a lot of changes that need to be done like that, but playing with a group, I know when I tried out for the main band I was in, there was a lot of telegraphing, like when certain tempo changes came through or different parts of the song came through. So that kind of like musician to musician eye contact and unvocalized communication just kind of like sparked my memory and reminded me of that really weird time when I played in a church band.
That's one thing that, as a non-musician, I've always really liked about live music is watching bands kind of jam out and play different songs, or like King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard will like do like snippets of other songs inside of their jams and stuff. And a lot of times it seems unplanned. But I really love that that the watching musicians interact with each other and communicate with each other non-verbally on stage is one of the funnest things about live music to me.
Well, and since we're at the end of chapter 5, let's go ahead and talk about the boarding of that flight. What was y'all's opinions on how that was done?
I really liked it. I do think it's interesting. I'm looking it up right now because it is stated that the UFO is not alien, like that it's earthly in some way. Let me there's some line in there where that seems to say that the UFO is as earthly origins, which I find very interesting. Just put
Yeah,
my
Gretchen
tinfoil
says
hat
it's
on.
not what we'd call a UFO is the way
Yeah,
she puts it.
just to kind of put my tinfoil hat on, in the last few years, especially in the last year, UFOs have been in the news a lot. They've been a topic of conversation, even with people as straight and normal as my family. Um, and I'm of the opinion that a lot of you, like, I don't really think that aliens are flying around in the sky. I think that if there are real UFOs, which I'm not convinced there are, because I've never seen one myself, that a lot of them are kind of like, corporate or government experiments in different types of aircraft and stuff. So I do wonder if that's supposed to be some type of like government agency that is taking people off the ship to experiment with them. If it's supposed to be some type of like criminal organization that is kidnapping people. Um, it's unclear why they're interested in Takeshi in particular as well. I don't think we ever get an explanation of that. Um, I mean, Takeshi is stated to be some type of karmic adjuster, where they could be wanting him to do a job for them, but why would he avoid them if so? Um, I find it very interesting to kind of sit around and ponder the kind of mystery of that whole scene. Um, and there's some kind of it's pretty funny that the cheap vodka is kept in the wing. That's a nice little detail.
At the reserve tank.
Yeah, which is I've been on some flights that, everyone is it did seem like yeah, I think I have been on a flight where they ran out of alcohol before, an international flight. People do really love to drink on airplanes. I have friends that have some pretty funny stories about like puking in their own backpacks and stuff.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is a little next level.
I actually have a little tip for any travelers. If you like to drink on flights and don't want to get cut off, book a flight on an airline operated by a Muslim theocracy. They will not cut people off. It's incredible.
Like Qatar Airways.
I cannot say any particular ones. I imagine Qatar's a little better because of just the clientele they cater to.
Mhm.
But yeah, no, Yeah, if you're in economy on some of those airlines, they will just let you keep drinking.
Interesting. Life hacks from Will.
Yeah.
No, I think you're onto something though, Luke. I think I kind of read that in that it fits with the upcoming theme in the next chapter of quote unquote deleting people. I certainly the UFO thing has definitely always interested me in the, I guess, in a kind of conspiratorial sense, but I've never really been able to subscribe to the idea that actual extraterrestrial visitors have come here. Just given, I spent a good chunk of my college time freelance studying astrophysics, I guess, and understanding how far apart things are in the universe, and that nothing can travel faster than light between them. It really kind of removes the possibility of anything like that happening. So I tend to read something like this more as a sort of covert government intervention of sorts, and Takeshi would be of interest to them. Although I'm with you in that I don't think that's ever explored further. Maybe that's something that he was going to put in, but just couldn't find a way to do it. I don't know. But it definitely seemed like an intentional kind of removal operation of sorts.
Yeah, I mean, with the Godzilla King of Monsters reference and the later possible appearance of a Godzilla-like creature, I could see there being something there with that, but I don't think it's ever made explicit. And um, yeah, I mean, I guess the Godzilla reference just could be a bit of foreshadowing
Mhm.
to later events. I don't know. Maybe I'll think about that some more, but in between episodes. But yeah, I mean, it is, and I love the fact that Cashy's a character in Gravity's Rainbow. Although I believe he's a kamikaze pilot in
Yeah,
Gravity's Rainbow,
yeah.
and I can't
One of
imagine that
two.
there's a whole lot of surviving kamikaze pilots due to the nature of the job. I do think it's interesting that he is stated to be one and then survives World War II. Um,
He may just not
and
be good
I
at his job.
That's true. Yeah.
That is fairly well implied by Gravity's Rainbow
Oh, okay.
that he is
Yeah.
bad at his job.
That yeah, that's a funny mental image of a kamikaze plane like missing the boat and stuff. Um,
Whoops.
Oh
yeah.
no, I didn't crash.
I really, this is the first time we get Pynchon's the way that he uses punctuation to let you know that the character is Japanese. Which is, I don't, in the modern time, like in 2023, it does scan as a bit much, I guess. Like if somebody were to do that these days, I don't think it would go over very well. That being
Yeah.
said, I mean, I have seen references to it being a reference to, like, Japanese movies and how that they were punctuated in the subtitles, which makes sense to me. And it does, like this book and Gravity's Rainbow and are very obsessed with film, so that would make sense. I also love that Takeshi starts off with "what it is,
Yeah, what it is,
bro."
bro.
Yep.
Yeah, which is like it's a very, like, I don't know if that's 80s slang. I have heard people in maybe in the 2010s ask what it is and stuff.
I think it's more of a 70s thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess this would be in the 70s as well. This scene. Um, yeah, I don't. It's also really enjoyable that, like, it's hard to tell because it's stated that he's blonde, and then it's stated that that's a wig, but Pynchon never states that Takeshi is Japanese in this section. We get his name, obviously, um, but the only real, like, actual solid clue is the like B movie dialogue thing. Yeah, I love this part. So
So I find it interesting that you both took the not exactly a UFO line to mean that it didn't. Well, that you read it as non-extraterrestrial. To me, I read that as much more rooted in the sense of we have the idea of a UFO. This is not the UFO. This is a slightly different thing. That's how I read that. And I'm, as always, I'm not saying that you guys are wrong. I just didn't read it that way. And it's interesting because it does not sound like people to me. It doesn't, like a robin's egg made of aluminum. It doesn't sound like a human thing, but it absolutely could be. What I really read it as is more that absolutely the world governments, plural apostrophe, are engaged in some kind of agreement with these aliens, but more in a procedural sense, less of a controlling one. And I also read, and now that you mention it, especially thinking of Takeshi and his pal in Gravity's Rainbow, I'm pretty sure that it is exactly what you described it as, Luke. But I read it as him trying to do like a California stoner impression.
Yeah.
But I've actually seen a UAP, but literally something that was probably like a falling satellite.
Well, and that's the thing is that 99.9% of the time, it ends up being that there is an explanation for it. I think people misconstrue the definition because when you really break it down, unidentified flying object is literally you see something, you just don't know what it is at that time.
Yeah.
But it's always just kind of associated as being something alien because we don't know what it is, and that's where our brains just kind of jump.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, I've spent most of my life in New Mexico, where Roswell happened. It's
yeah,
kind of
I went to
I was gonna bring
I
that
went to
up.
that museum. that was a trip.
How was that? I've never been to that museum.
You've never? Oh man, take the time out, boy. That is a sweet journey.
All right.
We went to Colorado like 4 years ago, and our halfway point was Roswell. So while we were there, we were like, we kind of just have to go see this thing, and it's the most amateur museum I've ever been to.
It's pretty shitty, isn't it? I
It's
think I went when I was a kid.
Everything is like all their quote unquote proof, which they put proof in like bold capital letters, is like hand drawn shit that like some dude in the desert saw a long time ago, and that's just his recollection of it. It's like I don't know if you guys remember the Alabama leprechaun thing that went viral a long while back.
I do.
If you blew that out and made a museum based around that drawing and the description, that's what their Roswell Museum is basically.
The whole town is kind of alien themed. Like the local Walmart has like aliens strung up outside and stuff.
They
the only
make
decent
so much money
has
off
a
of
UFO on the roof.
I went there. Yep.
It's
interesting. There was a guy in there who was yelling, I guess, and presenting something. I think he was like a guest speaker is what they were trying to get at. But then we saw him later like cleaning the floor, so I think he worked there too. I don't know. There was a lot. It was a lot. I'm glad I went though.
The interesting thing about that whole dynamic is that New Mexico is the place where that kind of stuff has happened for a very long time. The whole idea of UFOs being aliens, the whole idea of UFOs being like a governmental conspiracy is one that is strangely foreign to the culture here outside of Roswell, because that is how they stay alive as a town.
Oh yeah, that's their bread and butter. They have to.
Yeah, here is where the native peoples had stories of thunderbirds and various other things that fall under the UAP UFO category. So for me, it is much less of a like, oh, this thing is supernatural in a spooky modern way, and much more of a, you just kind of assume that there are limits to knowledge here. You assume that, yeah, people have seen thunderbirds. Who knows what they saw? But they saw something. Like, I know people who've seen things that are not real, and they're not crazy. They're not, conspiracy theorists. They're not even weird. They're just, they're part of a culture that sees those kinds of things more.
Yeah. We should get Tom DeLonge on the podcast and see what he can tell us.
I was going to say.
He's touring right now, so we'll wait.
Well, and then he has to go back to his federal job.
Yeah, that's true. Anything else that we want to talk about in chapter 5 before we go on to chapter 6?
What do y'all make of Takeshi Fumimoto's actual business card? What does it mean to you? Takeshi Fumimoto adjustments, phone book, comma, many areas.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's as mysterious as the nature of the card itself that seems to be capable of just kind of making itself present when its presence is needed. So I think maybe I don't know. I guess you could maybe it's penchant, so you could apply a certain level of mysticism to it, and a certain level of I hesitate to use the word paranormal, but a sort of otherworldly maybe presence to it that allows it to where you don't need to look it up in the phone book because it'll be there when you need it.
Yeah, there is a kind of a sense of anticlimax to it, at least not in this chapter, but in terms of, I want to say it's chapter 7 when it comes back up, um, where it seems to be, isn't it kind of like a thing where like you call the number or like you take out the card and then like basically like DL appears or Takeshi appears or something? Um, where
Yeah,
it's
something like
introduced
that.
as just kind of a business card that's very vague, and then later it's like almost like a magical like summoning thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, adjustments is so vague. It may be, adjustments to reality, which would
Insurance
explain.
adjustments.
That's
Karmic adjustments, yeah.
Yeah.
spinal adjustments.
Whatever you need at the time, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, in that context, it would make sense that some extraterrestrial species with nice supernatural powers would want to tamp down on Takeshi and his adjustments. I guess I'm sure it's a mess for them to clean up at times.
All right, so chapter 6, as I mentioned earlier, I think some of the best prose in the book to this point is in this chapter, and I think the opening paragraph, which I just want to read real quick because I absolutely love the writing here. Home between shifts, Frenesi sat with a cup of coffee at a kitchen table in an apartment in the older downtown section of a pale, humid Sunbelt city whose almost familiar name would soon enough be denied to civilian eyes by federal marker pens, sunlight streaming in unmitigated by tree leaves, feeling herself like a tune that always finds its home chord again, drawn, taken in, tranquilized by hopeful rearrangements of the past. Many of them, like today's, including her unknown daughter, Prairie, last seen as a baby smiling half toothless at her, trusting her to be back that evening as usual, trying to wiggle out of Zoid's arms that last time and into Frenesi's own. For years, whenever she and Flash moved any place new, in a reflex superposition, by now like sprinkling salt and water in every room, her thoughts would go to Prairie and to where, in each new arrangement, she would sleep, sometimes the baby, sometimes a girl she was free to imagine.
Part is incredibly sad.
It
Um,
really is.
yeah, I mean, I don't have any kids of my own. I do have, nieces. And it just kind of breaks my heart. I mean, that being said, it is. I want to say it's, and we don't know this yet. This may be a bit of a spoiler, but it's Frenesi's own fault
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
she doesn't have
absolutely.
Prairie, which maybe plays into like a guilt and shame and regret aspect to that paragraph. But she could have. I want to say she could have brought Prairie with her into witness protection. I imagine, if not for the machinations of Brock Vaughn, which we'll get to, I think, pretty late in the book.
Mm-hmm.
It is just super sad though that she does that.
It is. And I think if I had to try to reason out why she didn't take her, Brock aside, because I do think that is probably the largest part of it. I think she also maybe would have felt that by bringing Prairie with her, it would have denied her any kind of a normal life, in so much as Zoid could provide a normal life for her. I think it was better than any other alternative. And she was, given that she was doing what she was doing, she had to kind of make sure she could give Prairie the best that she had that she was capable of giving at that time.
Yeah, the way it this is not a read that is informed by later chapters. But I in this chapter and the immediately following ones, I see it a lot as a self-imposed exile of a sort, and in particular that she felt like in some way to take Prairie away from Zoid and or her mother would be going one step too far. Like it was more of an obligation, not just to Prairie in terms of having a relatively normal life, but also to the people she was leaving behind. And of course, as we all do, underestimating how much our own impacts would have on those those we create. But it is sad. It really is horribly depressing because
Yeah.
this whole chapter is just heaps of regrets. And regrets that we don't actually get to quite see Fernesi's opinion about, just that she has them.
Yeah. Well, moving on from that, I do. So we talked in chapter 1 about how mental illness was portrayed in this book, specifically as it related to Zoid at that time. And I think we maybe briefly touched on it in talking about Hector in the previous episode. And then in chapter 6 here, we finally kind of get a flash of Brock Vond, who we'll really get more info on later. But it's mentioned on page 69 that really no one knows what to do with him and his almost indescribable anger. That I think at that time in American history, and it really, you could maybe even make the argument that up to even now, it's still not really treated the way it should be, especially for people who are in a sort of authoritarian position where they have any kind of power over other people. That anger is always kind of almost justified, and I think it's kind of showing that Brock is this real, like, he's described as essentially a loose cannon that no one knows what to do with, but no one really seems to understand the implicit danger that's there in a person like that not being dealt with or handled properly.
Well, and I think the book will get into this a little bit. Not to say that I'm presaging the book, but my read on that is more of an extension of the Isaiah 2:4 shooting gallery kind of thing. The way that it ties into the 1984 type 2 minutes of hate. I view it as this is the way that certain people who would otherwise be fatal to the structure of society and the mechanisms of control in our world, without them, without that rage that those people have, they would be uncontrollable. And yet they have it, and because of that, they can be manipulated.
Well, on that note, that kind of leads into the next little thing I wanted to talk about, which and I kind of wanted to get y'all's opinion on the book. Kind of presents not just Zoid. We saw earlier, he's willing to take money from Hector Zuniga. Only he will not spend it on drugs, but he will take it and use it for other purposes. But we also see here with what's described as Fernesi's quote unquote specialist code, this use of power by people in power to use and manipulate people that they can kind of use to their advantage in whatever situation they need to. And I'm just wanting to get y'all's opinion on how that's presented, specifically as we see it with Fernesi now.
Yeah, it's phrased in or I at least link it to. Look, I'm looking at it right now. I linked that whole thing, that whole section to, um, her not being able to trust Flash and Flash being involved in extramarital affairs and stuff. Where once you betrayed somebody in a very deep way, like, once a cheater, always a cheater, I guess is what I'm getting at. I'm not sure I ascribe to that in my personal life. Um, but that's what it kind of makes me think of is, once you kind of betray those around you in such a deep and lasting way, um, there's no telling what else you'll be capable of. I could be reading it wrong or linking it to the wrong things, but
Yeah, that's how I basically read it as well. Not necessarily as exclusively relating to cheating, but I do think that that's the intention, is to be read as once you've been proven that you will turn your back on whatever you say your movement is, then you cannot be trusted in any other movement, whether it's the function of the state as Flash is, or interpersonally. Frenzy met Flash in a context where they both knew that Frenzy had left Brock Vond, and Brock Vond might have been a terrible person, but as far as Flash is concerned, that's still betrayal, right? Because you are what you say you are, and if you act beyond what you say you are, then people can't ascertain anything you are from anything you say in the future. And it all spirals out from there, whether it's political or social or specifically intimate relationships.
That makes sense. I think I maybe crossed a wire somewhere in my reading of that, but I see where you're both coming from with that. The section at the beginning of page 72 where I don't want to read the whole thing because it's pretty damn long, but the section starting what she hadn't been able to imagine in the improvident rush of those early days was that Nixon and his gang would also pass, Hoover die, even charades one day be enacted in which citizens could pretend to apply for and, if found worthy, read edited versions of their own government dossiers. I just wanted to get y'all's opinion on how that section plays into not just the themes of this book, but in pretty much all of his work. Because I think this is a pretty important section of the book here that we're getting into.
yeah, it comes up in other books. The reactionary nature of the government. I was recently listening to the Death is Just Around the Corner episodes about Crying About 49 and Gravity's Rainbow, and he points out that in Inherent Vice, the depiction of Doc and the other people driving around in a car, and the policeman saying that any group of four or more can be classified as a cult in the aftermath of the Manson murders. That those kind of laws were on the table in California and other places in the aftermath of the Manson murders. And I do think it's interesting that, like, I think that this would have been before all this. I mean, I forget when the interview with the Nixon aide, where they talk about the guy admits that, they villainize drugs just so that they could villainize their political opponents. I forget when that interview came out because it's often cited on Reddit now. Like it seems like daily almost that I see references to it. Probably maybe an exaggeration. Um, but I do think it's interesting that it does seem to kind of, it gets into the reactionary nature of the U.S. government, and how I think especially in the Reagan era, um, yeah, this book does talk about Reagan era budget cuts. I think that's the impetus for the informant witness protection thing being ended. That being said, I mean, in the Reagan era, one of the reasons that we won the Cold War is because we basically, I think I've seen this. I was a history minor in college, but most of the history classes I took were pre 20th century history classes. But I'm under the impression that Reagan kind of gave the green light to the military to spend ridiculous amounts of money in an effort to both outspend and bankrupt the USSR as they try to keep up. Um, and that type of spending seems to. I'm not an expert on the Nixon era in terms of the government and what we were spending money on. But this book, and I do trust Pynchon enough to stick to reality, that I'm sure that there was, like, it does seem to be probably based in fact that Nixon was pouring money into the war on drugs and the war on hippies and the counterculture. I find it very interesting that Flash is so interested in the Watergate debacle in terms of it being related to his own personal life, and how it will affect them. I can't really think of modern equivalents to that.
I think that's kind of part of it. I think with Watergate, the government's ability to kind of do these backdoor subterfuge kind of operations kind of fell apart at that point, and in a really kind of hilarious way. Like, they got undone in the dumbest possible way. And I think after that, not to say that they stopped doing that kind of backdoor stuff. I think they just got better about hiding it. But that was a big kind of moment in that time. And yeah, I'm with you in that. His reaction to it is definitely interesting, and how it relates to him specifically, or him and Frenesi really. But I that was where my mind went immediately, was that that signaled kind of the end of a lot of what was going on behind the scenes, or at least a sort of restructuring of how they did those things to kind of keep it under wraps and from getting out the way that it did at that time. Will, what about you? How did you feel about that?
Yeah, I read it as in line with the kind of continuum between the bank, the computers, and the government that I specified. I see this as on a character development level, and that this is the primary level, I think, when reading this paragraph. It is about Frenesi realizing that she had been naive in her own way. Sure, she'd been raised by a wobbly family. Sure, she had this, strong renegade streak, to the extent that, when she was a teenager, she was basically a young Republican, to use the phrase of the day. But she came back to the left side as she got older, and she didn't seem to hit. In this section, it seems like she's realizing that she didn't understand that it was not Nixon and his gang. It was not Hoover. It was this system continuing to work, and that she'd spent her years saying, yeah, down with the fascist Nixon, and that she'd missed the point that it doesn't matter who it is, that it's not Nixon doing this bad thing, it's not these bad people, that it is this structure.
Right. He's the visible element of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And on a more on a larger level, exactly the gap between Nixon's maneuverings that led to Watergate, leaving leaving a voicemail around. I don't, I'm too young. To me, Watergate is just where we get the suffix. But it is also it is this gap between the intentions of the individual politicians and the structure of politics. They couldn't decide who was going to be the next winner of the Republican primary, so they twisted it in their own way. And nowadays, just like Frenesi can't run around and go to off base check cashing places to get in under the wire before the cancellation signal is sent to the other banks. That doesn't exist anymore. There is no analog digital gap. There is no outside of the loop. The loop is everything now, or at least everything is curtailed by the loop, which is, in a metaphorical sense, these computers and the state.
One thing I find interesting about her issue with cashing the check, and the fact that they're basically taking off government benefits, is as us, yeah, the military carte blanche to spend money. But a part of Reaganomics, I believe, was the cutting of like stuff like welfare
Yep.
and stuff like that, where um, it is interesting to me that the government caused these people. I think Flash especially is shown to have been kind of coerced into turning into witness protection. You could say that Frenessy, you could, I mean, you, in my opinion, you'd be too charitable to Frenessy, but you could say that Frenessy was also kind of coerced. Um, the government kind of created these problems for these people where they turn them and then they don't take care of them. Where I think you get where I'm going with that, where,
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
government kind of doesn't take care of people and creates problems for people and then doesn't fix them. Which definitely does seem to be a big thing in the 80s, especially under Reagan, um, where, like I said, like Reagan was cutting while he was allowing certain parts of the government, unlimited spending. He was also cutting other parts of the government that are arguably more important to the everyday citizen. So,
Yeah,
Right.
in a lot of ways, I see this kind of series of scenes as like an inversion of Reagan's speech about welfare queens, right? This idea of people that by taking away the welfare, we will teach these people to stand on their own. This is Pynchon basically pointing out, hey, stand on their own? What the hell do you mean? You have created this structure in which these people are forced to fight to survive. And in this exact case, it is a deeply satirical version of that, where the government has literally required these people to like conditioned them to turn on their friends so that they're completely isolated, and then they are literally kicked out on the street from the home that they are legally required to inhabit, essentially. And it's not it's not quite that strict, but if you look at it the way that Hector did, which I think is a useful frame, it is like this Kafka-esque version of what Reagan was talking about.
Well, and let's jump from there to the revelation here that Fernessy has a major connection to Against the Day now with her family lineage, which is, yeah, I feel bad because we talked about the connections between Mason and Dixon and Against the Day so much, and now we have this major connection between Vineland and Against the Day. But in a much more explicit way than I think really any of the connections in Mason and Dixon, because here we have a character who appears in a pretty large role in Against the Day, being directly tied to Fernessy through her mom. And both of y'all have read Against the Day, right? I think
yes.
Kate's the only one that hasn't.
Yeah, I have read it.
Okay.
And yeah, all the parts about the traverses, especially their whole um, vendetta against the vibes, is pretty much the heart of that book for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love all the parts, especially in the beginning of all the stuff about unions. And is it the Kiesel girl kid?
Yeah. The
Kaiso
Kieselberg
Girl.
kid. Yeah. So yeah, it plays into the themes of of what Against the Day is getting at, a lot of with the corporations versus unions, and how all of the union busting activity that was taking place at the turn of the century impacted the workers and the businesses that were responsible for hiring the union busters. So I think this is a really interesting way of bringing those in. Did y'all feel like this was a kind of a natural, so to speak, connection, or did it feel forced or anything? Like, how do y'all come away with that knowing that these two are interconnected in the way they are?
It actually, to me, felt surprisingly natural. I was kind of, I don't know if it's, I wasn't born until 1989, the end of 1989. Um, and it's part of growing older and stuff where you like it does surprise me some that I believe Jess Reverse, I forget who he is in Against the Day, like which one of them he is, but the timeline of it, I struggle with like him being alive still, I guess, in these times. But that being said, it might just be a symptom of the fact that Against the Day only goes up until the early 1920s, I believe, if that makes
Mhm.
sense. Where um, it just surprises me that one of them would be alive to be the grandfather of Frenzy. Although, whenever I think about it in any type of in-depth way, it does. I think the timelines do match up fine.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Sidebar, I guess is it. Jess is he Reef's son with Estrella?
Yes, he's a lot of his appearance in the book is at the end of the book,
Yeah.
and there's a his daughter. No, I'm trying to remember the end. I don't want to. I shouldn't say anything because I don't want to get into the ending of Against the Day. Suffice to say that that might be one of my favorite scenes in that whole book is the ending with Jess.
So, but
And
he would have been born during the Mexican Civil War, right?
yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah,
it
timeline
does line
adds
up.
up. It does. Yeah, it does match.
yeah,
Or
whenever I
does
think
track.
about it a lot, it does match up. But just off the top of my head, it surprised me that what I'm saying
Yeah,
without
it
really
is
examining it.
unexpected. I think, but then I think when because I read Vineland after I read Against the Day the first time, and so it did feel natural in the sense that I think that the two books are in conversation with a lot of the same thematic elements, just taking place at different times, which again goes back to the whole that kind of cyclical nature of a lot of history. So I've always enjoyed the connection between the two, and I don't think it's so it's not overdone. I don't think or anything like that. But I think these books are kind of in a way in conversation with themselves
Yeah, it's almost like they were all written at the same
around the
time.
same time. I know, right? It's weird.
On the subject of Just Traverse, I do really like the absurd assassination attempt, where I've never heard of somebody trying to kill somebody else, although I'm sure it's happened in real life by having a tree fall on them.
It's like an old Looney Tunes thing.
It really
It
is.
is.
Yeah,
It
that's
because it's like you think the tree would be falling kind of slowly or something. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it was so unexpected that it makes sense that it would injure him at least. But it's I
well.
find that just to be so absurd.
When you think about some of the ways that the FBI or the CIA tried to eliminate Castro,
I
like
was
they
gonna
got into
yeah,
some pretty Looney Tunes
That's
shit
true.
themselves.
I
So
was gonna bring that up, yeah. And also it sucks that it's a redwood because those are so big. Like
yeah,
yeah, that'd really fuck you up.
Yeah, and I mean that's probably part of the joke, right? That it's this giant, majestic tree that's probably close to 1,000 years old or something,
yeah.
and it's just getting cut over to try to kill Jess for essentially no justifiable reason.
So I really enjoyed. There's a line in this section on page 77. The war changed everything. The deal was no strikes for the duration. A lot of us thought that it was some last desperate capitalist maneuver, a way to get the nation mobilized under a leader, no different than Hitler or Stalin. But at the time, so many of us really loved FDR. I got so distracted I quit working for a while, even though there were these incredible jobs everywhere, just because I had to try to think it through. You can imagine how much help I got. I think that's a really important paragraph as far as what is kind of being implied here with the themes of this book and with a lot of his stuff really that that especially World War II has this kind of unique place in American history where it did occur at that almost right moment to make a lot of social activism get put on the back burner. I don't know if y'all came away with the same impression there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you go from pre-38, you had, the Civilian Conservation Corps, you had all the New Deal programs running, and you had some of the lowest true unemployment. Sorry, what's the term? Absolute unemployment?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, some of the lowest in human history in that period. You had all of these unions coming together, and you had these these truly grassroots campaigns starting up, which ended up turning into the counterculture movement, which we all know and despise. But I think that's exactly what it's getting at. Because the idea of FDR being this sort of Trojan horse, even if he wasn't per se, you go into the war trusting FDR, come out of it with Truman. I mean, how more betrayed can you feel if you're one of these people?
I do really, this is a bit off topic, but I do really love that we get a good amount of description of the home front in World War II, which I can't think of any other book or piece of art, at least American or American focus, that really gets into it at all. Um, I've read stuff about the home front in England, which was technically probably part of the World War II war zone. Volman's Europe Central gets into Russia uh, during World War II, but not necessarily the war aspects. Um, but I find that a very, as much as Rosie the Riveter and stuff like that is ubiquitous even today. Um, the I can't think of any depictions of men who stayed home during World War II. I can't think of very many, at least, depictions of women working in factories during World War II. Um, I do think it's not necessarily stated, I don't think, in this section. But, this was a big, you could kind of link the women taking over like manager jobs in factories and kind of getting more leadership roles. You can kind of link that with the later kind of explosion of the feminist movement. I think, and I do think I've seen people talk about that, historians and philosophers make that link. But I really love this section. It does, I think I've read that Pynchon scholars who are professors have talked about how this is Pynchon's basically only book that female students can read and not come away like disgusted by Pynchon. Like, this is kind of his most feminist novel. Um, which I do think is this section is probably a part of why women enjoy this novel more than other Pynchon novels, perhaps.
Yeah, I think there's this is continuing to stray off topic, but there is an interesting phenomenon where this book is it is paired with Gravity's Rainbow only in the negative, instead of framing it as one of these books is about war, which is a manly thing done by men for men's reasons, and the other one is a story about these three women, essentially, four women once DL shows up, who've created the world around them. There's this interesting dichotomy inherent to that I think is often overlooked in casual conversation. But I just do love this section, if only because I think Sasha is one of the most badass characters
Absolutely.
in Pynchon's
She's super,
books.
super likable. Yeah.
She's awesome in every way. Every scene she's saying the badass but like morally upright thing. In every like flashback she's conflicted in a human way, and very believable and very root forable character.
Yeah, I absolutely love Sasha. And yeah, she's absolutely a badass. And I think the book does a good job of covering, in showing her history. It does a good job of examining how the going from the unions and the union excuse me, and the union workers at the turn of the century, and then and how they were sort of vilified throughout that stretch of time, especially after post World War II. And then how that fed into things like the Hollywood blacklist, which on page 81, I really enjoyed this part where to Sasha, the blacklist period with its complex court dances of fuckers and fuckies thick with betrayal, destructiveness, cowardice, and lying, seemed only a continuation of the picture business as it had always been carried on, only now in political form. And just, I think in these few pages and in this kind of backstory with Sasha, I think Pynchon just does such a great job of examining the evolution of all of that kind of darker side of American history, and how these workers were put into these situations and then vilified for, no provable offenses ultimately, but just as a means of controlling whatever situation they happen to be in.
Hey, now, they were getting rid of un-American activities.
I forgot about the house. I'm sorry.
It's very important to get rid of those un-American activities.
That era of America is very interesting to me, like the McCarthy era.
McCarthyism and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't necessarily have anything to add to that. It's just I find it very interesting that the whole like backstabbing and you writing your name on a list of attendees at a communist party like 10 years ago could get you fired in the present day and stuff.
Yeah. It was really fascinating to see how people could be like, not just turn on each other, but be kind of coerced into turning on the people that they care about. It's fascinating, but it's really, really dark. It's a really unfortunate period of American history, and there are many of those. But yeah, that's one that I've kind of always really been fascinated by as well.
Yeah, there's a reason that the perennial favorite dividing line in not just American, but our world history is World War II. Because prior to that point, the governments, to be clear, were using, the mechanisms of control, however you want to talk about them. And, there were winners and losers. But after World War II is when, America, the land of the free, started using those mechanisms on the white people too. And that is a change. That it is a clear dividing line, and there's a reason that it's in the center of all of Pynchon's works.
Yeah. Well, moving on from that, I do want to briefly come back to something we've talked about throughout these previous chapters: the power that television has, and specifically on page 83, the line, "Believing that the rays coming out of the TV screen would act as a broom to sweep the room clear of all spirits, Furnessy now popped the tube on and checked the listings." And that's going to get into another little thing that I want to go over with y'all, but I think again we're seeing this idea of TV having a sort of almost mythical capability of whether it be people thinking that it can be cleansing or that it can wipe away whatever problems they're feeling. It shows, I think, the real power that this at this time kind of newish technology was really starting to have a grip on America as a society.
Yeah, that particular section, for some reason, I'm not entirely sure why, really reminded me of the phenomenon of those boxes that started being sold in the late 90s that imitated the way that a CRT television would project against the opposite wall.
Oh, yeah.
The conceit of it was essentially, if you're younger than me and therefore don't know about these things, that if you're at home, you will always have your television on. So if you're going on vacation, you don't need a house sitter. All you need to do is plug it into a normal like timer socket, and it'll turn on at 6 p.m. and turn off at 10, and nobody just wandering by will assume that you've left your house empty because the television is there, essentially.
It was a weird home security system that existed at that time.
Yeah, and it makes sense. It's not...
It does, yeah.
There's not just like this symbolic resonance. It is also a practical matter of, if you normally watch TV, it makes sense to have something look like you're watching the TV, like everything is normal, in the same way that, you might have your house sitter turn on lights at a certain point in time.
Yeah.
But it is also resonant symbolically.
So that scene leads into the scene with Furnessy watching Chips, which, for those of you who don't know what Chips was, I don't even.
How could you?
I mean, yeah, like it's got to be streaming somewhere.
It's on Freevee or something. Yeah.
It's if you want to watch the thrilling adventures of the California Highway Patrol and Eric Estrada in the prime of his career, go spend some time with. I think I wasn't the first of those kind of cop shows, but it was definitely the beginning of that wave of your Hawaii Five-O's and not Natch Bridges. What was it? Miami Vice.
Yeah.
And a lot of those kind of shows, which I find it interesting that that's what Furnessy watches when this scene is happening, because there is this sort of, at this time in television and in general, I think there was this, and it still exists really, I think this sexualization of authority figures and people in uniform. And if nothing else is responsible for that, TV has really done a good job of kind of pushing that concept, which, given the nature of this book and the themes of it, I can't help but see that as a sort of, a way of, if you get people seeing authority figures in that light, you're more inclined to let them dominate you, for lack of a better term. I don't know. Did y'all have the same kind of feeling with that?
I had a fairly different feeling in that it really, especially given the connections to the traverses and Sasha's internal monologue, wondering if she somehow passed along the fetish for the uniform to her daughter. It really, it makes me feel like we need to discuss the most problematic element of Against the Day, which we're not going to, obviously. That's not what this podcast is about. We're talking about Vineland, but I feel like I can't talk about it without dragging that all in. So suffice to say, no, not quite, but I get what you're saying.
I do like that it's kind of a, like Pynchon does, as we've talked about a little bit in this podcast, not very much, but a little bit. Pynchon does consistently depict, kinks and fetishes of various kinds throughout his books. And this is kind of maybe the most innocent, or one of the most innocent or commonplace ones that he depicts. It's not, I think that, say you were to tell some, your Mormon friend about having sexual feelings for people in uniform, they're not going to be super like offended or freaked out, if that makes sense. It does seem to kind of be, it's one of the more mainstream types of deviant sexuality that Pynchon gets into, which I like. I like the fact that it's kind of more low stakes and not as disgusting as some aspects of Gravity's Rainbow and stuff. It seems to be kind of, it does. I do kind of dislike how much you can define Furnessy through her fetish for men in uniform. How much of you can kind of boil down her motivations in this book to just, being turned on by men wearing uniforms, in terms of how much her relationship with Brock Vaughn seems to be a driving force for who she is and what she does. That's an oversimplification of Furnessy as a character, but you can view her through that lens, I think. And I think if you read this book on a very surface level, that's what you're going to take away from it. But I don't know, I find it kind of a nice, kind of quirky, little funny thing about her, that does flesh her out as a character a little bit more and make her seem a bit more human.
Yeah, I do like that immediately following that, the interaction she has with the two officers that show up plays out exactly like a scene in one of those shows would, with the lead cop, kind of like leaning up on the door frame and talking, the way they're talking to each other. It just very much plays out like something would on one of those shows.
Yeah, I mean, that scene, as well as other scenes in this book, do seem like almost straight out of a TV show.
Yeah, in some ways, I read that particular scene as less of a manifestation of her, soft spot for men in uniform, and almost more of a general, like, the old school symbolism implied by cheating and infidelity, of just the general, like, lack of satisfaction in life. Because it's talking about her thing for men in uniform. That's there, obviously, but I think that it also is, indulging our tendency as readers of his books to overanalyze stuff. I think in a lot of ways we are also supposed to see this as a fairly normal occurrence, and beyond just the, this is normal for her or normal for somebody who has this preference, but just like, hey, Flash seems kind of like an asshole. I don't know about you guys. Flash did not make a great impression on me. I would understand why Frenzy would be looking outside of the marriage, He doesn't seem to care that much about the sanctity of the relationship, so why should she?
Yeah, that's a fair point. So that takes us into the realization by Flash and Frenzy that they are in a sort of dangerous situation. We kind of got to talking about earlier with them being essentially deleted from the system, and this paranoia that surfaces as a result of it, which I think is interesting because in looking back at the 60s, you had this kind of paranoia of, everyone, and I think that's the general idea of paranoia, is this idea that you're being watched, or that there's an interest in you and what you're doing and all of that. But then we get this kind of inverse of it of, now we're in this time of ubiquitous computer use and the ease with which anyone can essentially be removed from the system. So rather than, having this concern of always being monitored and watched and seen, it's now become this sort of fear of being removed and taken out of the equation, and the helplessness that comes along with that.
Yeah, and I'm going to read what you wrote in the notes here, because I do think that it links into what I was talking about earlier with the poking fun at Reagan's welfare queen speech better than I phrased it, I think. You wrote, the paranoia of surveillance prevalent in the 60s becomes paranoia of deletion in the 80s. And I think that's a very succinct way of putting kind of the core theme of this chapter, that things have changed in ways that nobody foresaw, and in particular, that way. I think that you really hit the nail on the head with that.
Yeah, and in reading this, there is a sort of abject horror that comes with, like, really, like, when you really kind of sit down to think about the impact of essentially being deleted like that. And it's still a scary thing in 2023, but it's almost uncomprehendable in this time in history, in the mid 80s. Like, the idea that you can just, it's not even being killed. I think it goes beyond that to the idea of almost erasing your entire existence is a level of horror that I think is almost difficult to wrap your head around.
Yeah, it's one thing to disappear from the town you grew up in a pre-modern era. You just leave, and people talk about you, and that, and you're fine with, and that, some people that you did care about will miss you, and you'll know that the people who you don't care about are talking bad about you behind your back, but whatever, they're behind you. Yeah. And then we had this 50-year period of slowly getting used to the idea of, hey, you're going to exist here whether you like it or not. People are going to keep talking about you. This record will be here. And it slowly morphed into the extent of, hey, this record here is merged with that record over there. You cannot escape that. And so we stopped viewing ourselves as ourselves and more as a network of relations, which in a sense we always have been. But then to have that flipped so that network is no longer humanoid, but computer. That network is no longer, well, if I'm nice, if I ask the right guy, I can get this check cashed, to, well, I'm a zero.
Yep. And I do love the fact that I didn't write it down, but I gotta see if I can find it. Now, essentially, it's the fact that Justin is the one that kind of keys them into what's going on, Oh yeah, here it is on page 88. Justin, pizza slice hovering en route to his face, said maybe they got their budget lines axed out. Flash gave him a quick head take as if awakened by a practical joke. Used to be a kid right here. What happened? What have you been hearing, Justin? He shrugged. Keep telling you guys, you should watch McNeil and Lair. There's all this budget stuff going on all the time with President Reagan and Congress. It's on now if you're interested. I love the fact that a kid is aware of McNeil and Lair Hour, which is a really dated reference at this point, but would have been a pretty. I mean, it's still, for someone who knows what that was, is pretty hilarious. But yeah, it's I don't know. I really, that whole concept and that whole idea of removal from the system like that is just absolutely bizarre and frightening to me. That moves us into the end of the chapter and the Frenessi's frantic attempt really to try and cash this check, and the way in which the area around is described. I know, Luke, you brought it up earlier. Did you want to kind of touch on that with the whole, the layout, the urban sprawl essentially here, with like the different gates and everything?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of my obsession with this small section is I've been on safari in Africa, and at least one of the game areas I've been to, there are a bunch of different gates, and which gate you go in and which gate you come out of can kind of define what animals you see and what what roads you're on and different stuff. So maybe that's, I'm now realizing, is part of my obsession with this part. But it does seem to kind of, like, the fact that there's 7 gates to this military base, and it seems like there's almost an endless amount of gates. It says there are at least 100 of these gates, um, which I can't think of. I spent my high school years in Colorado Springs, where there are a lot of military bases. It's where the Air Force Academy is. For reasons I won't get into, I did have to go to the Air Force Academy a fair amount growing up as a teenager, and I think there's only like 2 or 3 gates into the Air Force Academy, maybe just 2. So the fact that there's hundreds of these, it does kind of speak to the military base being like perhaps endless, or like a maybe like Area X, where it's like this weird like liminal zone where,
Oh,
like, like time and space don't really matter, and it's just kind of like this endless other region or something. Um, it says, it doesn't say there's 100 of them. It says there's at least 100. Um, and yeah, the whole like thing of there being like a city that has kind of grown out of there being a gate right there, is also really interesting to me. Um, I also just really like the fact that there's 2 part-time high school girls working there.
yeah.
Um,
One of whom is a
they
manager.
Yeah, one of them's a manager, which, I still, I work at a pizza place right now, and there are 18, 19-year-old people that work there. It's mostly adults, but there are some younger adults that work there. It's Yeah, I just really love that whole part, and I have some more to say about the end of the chapter, but if you all have anything to say about that, the part about the gate, you can.
I didn't have anything to add to it. I thought you summarized it pretty well.
Yeah, pretty much. Albuquerque's got kind of a similar setup to Colorado Springs, but with just the one base. So I'm familiar with what you're talking about. There is a weird fragmentary quality to all of that. But yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, so the end of the chapter, this is something that's actually been on my mind since we went over the Crying of Lot 49. It's something that I meant to bring up for I think the final chapter of the Crying of Lot 49, which I did not bring up during that episode for some reason. I can't remember why. But the Crying of Lot 49, the final chapter, it does seem to imply, to me at least, that the modern concept that I believe, I don't know philosophy well enough. I guess it could be, I'm not sure if it's really philosophy. It could be an aspect of physics, could be an aspect of mysticism. could be kind of a confluence between philosophy, mysticism, and physics, which I know is kind of a popular concept that those three are related. Anyways, that the whole idea of reality being some type of computer simulation, Pynchon does seem to kind of be getting at that in the last chapter of Crying in Block 49. I have to bring out the book and look over it, and I can't really do that right now. Maybe I'll try to bring it up again or read that section again before we finish Vineland. But the end of this chapter, God is described as a hacker.
Mhm.
The narrator states that we are digits in God's computers, um, which I would imagine that the whole reality as a computer simulation had been a thing by 1990. I know it's only kind of recently been popularized in popular culture and TV shows like Atlanta. Um, there are other our Devs, the TV show Devs does get into that some. I mean, it seems to be kind of a bigger and bigger thing as time goes on. Um, but I think that the Crying of Block 49 and that being possibly a part of the final chapter, I have to think that's one of the first instances of that idea being put on paper. So it does seem interesting to me that Pynchon is kind of riffing on that idea again. Um, and while I can't think of specific instances in Inherent Vice, the third part of the California trilogy, where he gets into that. I mean, Inherent Vice does get into the early versions of the internet and different. It does have a on again, off again focus on technology and the way that computers affect our everyday lives. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I do think that Crying of Block 49 is the first, if not one of the first, instances of that being put on paper. Um, and I do really love when Pynchon is prescient like that.
Mhm.
Um, and I have to imagine, I was when this book came out, I think when it was being put on shelves, it might have been like the week I was born because I think it was put on shelves at the end of 1989, and I was born at the end of December 1989. So I'm obviously not aware of how popular the whole reality as a simulation thing was in 1989, 1990. But I can't imagine it was nearly as big of a I can't imagine it's nearly as big of a thing as it is nowadays. So I do really love that Pynchon seems to have kind of um, predicted that rise in that idea. Um, and I find that whole concept really interesting to think about. I have to imagine that people that have gotten this far into the podcast are familiar with it. But I think the basic idea there with the whole reality being a simulation thing is that in the future, or for aliens or something that with the way that computer chips work and the way that the advancements of technology work and the fact that I forget what the name of the rule is, but the whole thing about um, the size of a possible hard drive being like doubled every year and a half or 2 years thing means that in the future or for aliens that they would have like almost literally infinite
Yeah.
computing power. um
Exponential growth of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, because if you look at the graph, I'm making this thing with my hand where like it just rises and so once it starts rising a lot, it just gets like infinite basically.
Yeah. It doesn't take long to
um
get massive.
yeah. Which I think that rule, the doubling of the hard drive size or the amount of like computing power in like an inch by inch computer chip, that rule has been around since I want to say at least the 70s, if not the 60s.
So yeah, so that's Moore's law, and it's actually very sadly, it has been declared dead. Um, but that is much more of probably like there was never a fundamental physical reason that Moore's law worked. It was just a trend line on the way that chips were being manufactured. But yeah, no, it uh, up until a couple of years ago, it did seem like there was no natural limit to how small and efficient you could make a computer chip, and there may still not be, but yeah. I think the truth is that if you want to be very loose about it, the idea of the universe being a simulation goes back to Descartes and Hegel, probably mostly. But yeah, I'm not sure there was anybody before Pynchon who tied those ideas together in any way that wasn't strictly science fiction.
Yeah, that's definitely.
Yeah.
But I take it, I take that section of Lot 49 as more of a kind of a continuing on the psychological reading of that book. I take it as essentially Oedipa having computers as an instance of that kind of determination being truly visible and traceable and understandable by humanity, and viewing it as a metaphor more for God than as anything else in Lot 49. But Vineland here was published post Philip K. Dick's Valis, which is kind of a book about that. So I totally think that it's very much a subject in Vineland here. The idea that God's computer is our universe, or God is a computer and that is our universe. However you want to frame it, pantheistic, panentheistic, deistic, it all kind of meshes together in a very similar way post Dick.
Yeah, and Ubik, Phil K. Dick's Ubik also kind of gets into that as well. The Pynchon Wiki, I want to say, does kind of trace a like the influence of Philip K. Dick throughout this novel. I'm blanking on any specific uh, parts of Vineland that they point out, but it is a thing throughout the Pynchon Wiki where they bring it up at least 3 or 4 times, I want to say.
Yeah, that sounds right. All right. Anything else we wanted to go over on chapter 6?
No.
I just do love the entire discussion of zeros and ones for humanity.
Yeah.
And the use of that as a not simply as a how much is determined, how much is in control of them, whether them is God or them is the government or them is a shadowy cabal, whatever they are. Beyond that, I see that as also a more simple postmodern, just pointing to the way that we dehumanize ourselves. And I think that it's in that way very depressing.
Yeah.
I think it's very effectively so.
Yeah. It's true. Did y'all have any particular funny parts that you wanted to point out? I didn't really have anything to add here, honestly. Like I would just point to the whole the airline in chapter 5 and Zoid's job distracting people and the flight crew's attempts at distracting them once they had been boarded. I just found all of that pretty amusing.
Yeah, I like that part too. I mean, it is absurd in a nice way. My favorite comedic part is a pretty small one. It's on page 75 where they're talking about, I think, the San Francisco Bay and during World War II, and it says everybody's smoking, chewing gum, drinking coffee, some all at the same time.
Yeah,
Which,
that's
like,
good.
I've tried to smoke cigarettes and chew gum at the same time, and it is horrible. It's not a fun experience.
It's not.
No.
And like
No.
drinking coffee on top of that is just, I can't imagine.
Coffee and cigarettes is fine. Coffee and gum is not good. Cigarettes and gum is not good. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can't imagine the three altogether would be anywhere near enjoyable.
No.
My first instinct would be to point to something we've already covered, which is just specifically the description of the synthesizer with its 3 choruses of 8 ukuleles.
Yeah, and its squirreliness.
Yeah, but further on in chapter 6, referring to Flash's general attitude, Out on the highway especially, he'd been known to go actively chasing down motorcycle police, forcing them over to the shoulder, jumping out to pick fights. The unfortunate trooper would cower side saddle in his bike seat, squirming, thinking, this is crazy, but unable to find the button on his transmitter. Strange. Furthermore, just because they let you ride around on this look at this piece of shit. I've seen mopeds could shut this sucker down. What is this? Who makes it? Fisher Price? Mattel? Is this Barbie's motorbike or some shit? In some men, such carelessness might indicate a soft streak a yard wide, but not in Flash, a vigilante of civil wrongs, settling things with his lethal and large caliber mouth. I don't think I need to explain the comedy.
Yeah,
there.
no, that's good. That's good. Quotes. Luke, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, my favorite quote from these sections is chapter 6, page 71. Sure, she knew folks who had no problem at all with the past. A lot of it they just didn't remember. Many told her one way and another that it was enough for them to get by in real time without diverting precious energy to what, face it, was 15 or 20 years dead and gone. But for Frenessy, the past was on her case forever. The zombie at her back, the enemy no one wanted to see, a mouth wide and dark as the grave. Um, yeah, I mean, I've mentioned how I'm bipolar on this podcast, and whenever I'm manic, I tend to spend a lot of time in the past. And it's come up in therapy recently for me with, um, whether or not I'm avoidant of the past whenever I'm in a normal state of mind and stuff like that. And that whole section just kind of spoke to me, um, and kind of helped me kind of frame stuff I'm going through in the present, which is always nice when you find a book that can address what you're going through in the present moment.
Oh, absolutely. I think being able to find any media that you can relate to on that kind of a level is really important. I think that, and I think that's something. And I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's something that started to finally kind of get more attention, and I think there's more art being made with that in mind, or at least we're more open to it now than maybe we were in the past. So I think it's able to people are able to create more that can reach more people in a significant way, which is really important. So for me, I went with almost the last paragraph of the book. This is at the end of chapter 6. It was there, gazing down a long aisle of frozen food, out past the checkout stands and into the terminal black glow of the front windows, that she found herself entering a moment of undeniable clairvoyance, rare in her life but recognized. She understood that the Reaganomic axe blades were swinging everywhere, that she and Flash were no longer exempt, might easily be abandoned already to the upper world, and any unfinished business in it might now resume, as if they had been kept safe in some time-free zone all these years, but now, at the unreadable whim of something in power, must re-enter the clockwork of cause and effect. Someplace there would be a real axe, or something just as painful, Jasonic blade to meet final. But at the distance she, Flash, and Justin had now been brought to, it would all be done with keys on alphanumeric keyboards that stood for weightless, invisible chains of electronic presence or absence. If patterns of ones and zeros were like patterns of human lives and deaths, if everything about an individual could be represented in a computer record by a long string of ones and zeros, then what kind of creature would be represented by a long string of lives and deaths? It would have to be up one level at least, an angel, a minor god, or something in a UFO. It would take 8 human lives and deaths just to form one character in this being's name. Its complete dossier might take up a considerable piece of the history of the world. We are digits in God's computer. She not so much thought as hummed to herself in a sort of standard gospel tune. And the only thing we're good for to be dead or living is the only thing he sees. What we cry, what we contend for in our world of toil and blood, it all lies beneath the notice of the hacker we call God. I absolutely love that passage. I think it is extremely heavy, and but it really speaks to, as we talked about just a few minutes ago, really talks to the major kind of theme, or one of the major themes of this book.
Yeah, it's a beautiful passage, as heavy as it is. I chose I guess it's about a third of the way into chapter 6. Silence in the place, their son Justin asleep in the tube light. Prairie, who hadn't ever been there. The philodendron and the parlor palm, wondering what was going on, and Eugene the cat, who probably knew. For Nezzy took her hand away from Flashes, and they all got back to business, the past. A skip tracer with an obsessional gleam in its eye. And still a step or two behind, appeased for only a little while. Sure, she knew folks who had no problem at all with the past. A lot of it they didn't remember, and then it leads into Luke's section. But I love that the setting piece there.
Yeah.
That first set of sentences I think are just kind of perfect in terms of establishing.
What would you say is your most pinch-on part of these chapters?
So I was gonna say that you stole mine, Cody, with your quote.
Oh,
So my most mentioned part is on page 60. Only thing that holds me back in reference to suicide, I think, Zoid blowing his nose at length, is the indignity of lying there all splattered by the pool and in my last seconds on Earth hearing Jack Lord say, "Book him, Dano, suicide one." Um, which I mean, making a joke out of suicide is fine with me personally, but it is, like the whole, Zoid's confusion of TV with reality is very Pinchonian. And I just Pynchon's the only person the only author I know that has the balls to make a joke like that, to have somebody, like, I think that's a Y50 reference, if I'm not wrong.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I just love that part, and it strikes me as the most mentioned part.
What about you, Will?
Well, I will suffice with pointing vaguely at Zoid's playlist when the aliens show up. I think that between "Do You Believe in Magic" to Godzilla King of Monsters theme
Yeah.
to the wacky coconuts and all, it's just great.
Yeah. I think for me, it's it comes down to a tie. I think between the concept of the airline that Zoid works for, just the over the top Hawaiian theme, and like reconverting an airplane into what it becomes, to where really it would be unflyable, but the idea of it flying is even funnier. It's either that or the absolute I guess generous helping we get of musical Easter eggs. I think that really speaks to what he does as a writer. It's someone who really appreciates and understands music. I always like those to be thrown in like that, and there was quite a lot of them in these two chapters.
Yeah, usually they're a lot more subtle than he kind of indulged in on these chapters, and it's
Yeah.
nice. It's nice.
Yeah. So we got a response from Nick, who in our last episode gave us a really good series of questions that led to a really fun and interesting discussion. Did one of you want to go ahead and read his reply to us?
I can read it. Wow, I didn't expect that level of engagement. Thank you. Been listening as I fight through a miserable flu, so not sure if I'm totally lucid in input or output, but fuck it, we ball. I hope you're feeling better, by the way, Nick.
Yeah, for real.
Flu's never fun. And yeah, you're welcome. We always, as we talk about a lot, we love hearing from listeners. It's one of the highlights of doing this podcast. I also just kind of randomly love that you said, fuck it, we ball. Anyway, so that scary movie versus Beastie Boys angle is really fruitful, but one-dimensional as all Spectra are. Not a knock on y'all. It does a good job of showing how your tongue placement, whether you're sticking it out at the subject of your parody or leaving the tongue in cheek, signals certain levels of self-awareness to the reader. Where I'd want to add dimensionality to the analysis is in the satirist's relationship to their subjects. I see another Goldilocks conundrum to one's observer-participant status. Too observational and distant, the satire is hollow, only able to invoke and transform the shallowest stereotypes of your subject. Too participatory and involved, the satire loses track of the ground by which we might distinguish a figure, i.e., lost in the sauce. The best satire will expose rot at the heart of a thing without being too complicit in it, or, if that's impossible, recognizing one's complicity. To me, the scary movie spoofs are disingenuous because they're as stupid as the movies they're lampooning, but present like they've solved the formula, whereas the original Zucker were both more inventive, possibly earning a superiority they'd be quick to reject. The Beastie Boys example is murkier because while they've committed to the bit, I've always seen the Beasties as goofy bros going all the way back to their days as a hardcore band. They might claim to dislike the frat boys, yeah, I thought it said frat bros, frat boys they're clowning, but not unlike the spoof movie, they're more similar to their subject than they might admit, which is probably why they feel the need to spoof, to create that critical distance. This is me talking. I have to say I agree on that. Where the Beastie Boys do seem to be kind of hard partying people, and it seems to be like the music is kind of party music. Anyway, going back to Nick's words, this is why I'm much more interested in / charmed by the performance of the goofy bro enacted in a show like Workaholics, where there is genuine love for the party personae they caricaturize on the show. This is me again. I love that you mentioned Workaholics in relation to, and I guess this is only tangentially related to the pension, but I just never thought we'd talk about Workaholics on this show.
It's a good show.
It is. It's a fun show. Going back to Nick, this taps into and shows the exchange between another spectrum, sincerity and irony. We engage in performance of self that are simultaneously sincere and ironic, and this is perhaps truer to the way we experience our ridiculous ass selves. Bringing this back to pension, I'd imagine he has mixed feelings about mixed behaviors. He's an obsessive virtuoso who has been willing to lock himself away from humanity in search of a transcendent art. But he's also a regular guy with regular desires, not limited to eating junk food and watching the tube. Whereas a more biting or acerbic satirist will snipe subjects from a distance, Pynchon's zaniness feels like an acknowledgement of proximity and multiplicity, a way to breathe empathy and appreciation into the critique. He's laughing at them, but also laughing with them. This is me talking. I do really like that you point out that Pynchon is a human being and he has his own idiosyncrasies. I think one thing that's lost in Pynchon fandom is that Pynchon is probably just a dude who, has some kind of weird interests and stuff. I have heard some anecdotes from authors who have met Pynchon, had dinner with Pynchon, that he will talk about things like the engineering of airplanes and stuff at length, different types of stuff like that, where it's not, he's not sitting there being some nomic swami, he's just being a regular dude who has, stuff to say about a wide variety of subjects. Back to Nick, read Dark Night of the Soul. I guess this goes to questions of tolerance for confrontations with ugliness and evil. If you're trying to get the average person / reader to engage with something they don't want to, a joke makes sense, but I don't think Pynchon has ever been writing to / for that crowd. I don't think he's writing just for me either, but I don't need the humor to make this confrontation more palatable and feel like it often risks distraction. I know I argue that comedy and tragedy are linked in interesting, devastating ways in Vineland, but I don't need something so high concept or intricate so long as the humor is creative. I'm right there with you that the description of the Bodhi Dharma Pizza Temple is so ecstatic and on point and joyful. I'm glad to read it for its own sake. Maybe this is where the line between zany and funny is. Zany usually refers to comedy as a vibe / affective identity marker without actual laughs. Zany is used to write off the unserious or make begrudging acknowledgement that a genuine genius underlies the play. Okay, that's all for now. Thank you again for engaging. Love a good discourse. I want to expand and refine this thinking. So I don't know if any of us have anything major to say back, Nick. I love the email. As Cody, I think, mentioned last week, I did really like your essay. about Vineland. It struck a nice chord between kind of autobiographical and maybe a more scholarly viewpoint. Yeah, as a we appreciate you sending us these emails. We appreciate how in depth these emails have been. You make some good arguments. Yeah, so glad you're listening and enjoying it.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, and I absolutely agreed. There was some great points made in here, and we could go back and forth almost endlessly on something like this. But I do think that Nick made some really, really good points, and I do really, I just want to kind of reiterate what Luke said, that I do really appreciate your reminding us to remember that Pynchon is a human like the rest of us are, and that we have to respect that and consider that when we talk about him, and not necessarily put him up on a pedestal. As we mentioned at the beginning of your response, I hope you're feeling better. I know the flu sucks, and hopefully it wasn't terrible for you, and you're feeling better now. And if not, get well soon, and just get lots of rest and hydrate. But thanks for a well thought out and really enjoyable response.
Yeah, I mean, I beg to differ. I think that Pynchon is clearly a talking dog, so we differ on that level already. But beyond that, I want to point out that what you're getting at with the Pynchon's zaniness feels like an acknowledgement of proximity and multiplicity, a way to breathe empathy and appreciation into the critique. That is about half of what I was trying to get at with the Dark Night of the Soul discussion. So I think we're more or less on the same page there. But yeah, like Cody said, we could talk about this for days, and it'd probably best not to monopolize the podcast. So thanks again for writing in. We do appreciate it. We're not ignoring your thoughts. We are just trying to not make them the subject of the show, because they are good enough that they could take up an hour.
Yeah, we really could devote a long time to it. But do keep writing in if you have more, comments and questions and whatnot. Really, the discourse is appreciated, and I'm happy to continue it. In different areas of this book.
I did have one more thing. What do y'all think about the whole DIDT or T apostrophe N thing, the Diditin thing?
Man, I can't.
In this book?
My brain sees it, and I can't make my mouth make that sound.
I know.
So
yeah.
it's like hey man, I didn't know you were down there. It's Southern California.
Yeah.
Didn't. It's New Mexico dialect, which has a whole Wikipedia page I found out a while back.
Oh wow.
It is that. That's something that we share. So it's pretty natural to me. But yeah, it's didn't. It's Didden is the way to pronounce it.
I got my mind to make the sounds. Like I went over it in my brain so long, but I got my mind to make the sound, but I can't make my mouth make the sound.
Yeah, I'm exactly there with you. Yeah.
Didn't.
That being said, I did forget to mention the impression of Betty Davis that was done in chapter 6. The way she talks was so perfect. If anybody who knows Betty Davis and has seen her movies, that was spot on and hard to write. I would think that's a weird thing to put on the page, but it was well done. Anyways, that does it for chapters 5 and 6. We will be back next week to talk about chapters 7 and 8. As always, thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
See ya.